Over the course of this week, we are going to get an in-depth exploration into the topic of the Second Indochina War, often referred to as the Vietnam War in the United States and the American War in Vietnam. The Second Indochina War is actually the proper formal name for this conflict, which lasted essentially from the mid-1950s through the mid-1970s, only formally ending in 1975, although the United States would withdraw troops from Vietnam in 1973. As you may recall, the foreign policy legacy of the JFK administration would play a critical role in the history of the Republic of Vietnam from 1963 onwards, especially as JFK himself, as President of the United States, would green light the plot to assassinate the President of the Republic of Vietnam just before his own assassination. You may also recall that Lyndon B. Johnson's foreign policy in the Second Indochina conflict was also disastrous, beginning the air war and leading to Nixon's victory in the 1968 elections. However, this did not mean that Nixon did not have his own foreign policy disasters, including and especially scaling up the ineffective air war during the course of the Second Indochina War, illegally bombing Cambodia, paving the way for the recruitment of the so-called Khmer Rouge Army, and the eventual genocide that occurred in the political vacuum in Cambodia, created in no small part by American bombs. Nixon would also back the torturous Saigon regime in the Republic of Vietnam. Of course, the activist left in the United States had a response to the Vietnam War as well. Dolores Huerta, for example, who is pictured here, was opposed to U.S. involvement in Vietnam in a military sense. The Third World Liberation Front, the women's movement, and numerous student movements, especially those associated with the Black Student Union, the BSU, and furthermore, the Black Panther Party, or the BPP, all worked closely together to oppose the Vietnam War, so-called, or the Second Indochina War, properly called, in the context of the politics of the United States during the course of the 1960s and the early 1970s. Now, American textbooks don't usually dig deeply enough into the context of the Second Indochina War. First, we have to consider when the Japanese Empire pulls out of Southeast Asia, it has left behind a climate of pro-nationalist and anti-colonialist sentiment, leading to the sudden proclamations of independence in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam in relatively short order, all within almost a year, when Nguyen Ai Quoc would step out into the square and proclaim Vietnam as independent in the Declaration of Vietnamese Independence. Furthermore, he would cite from the American Declaration of Independence. Nonetheless, the French colonial government would not recognize this claim, and Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh militia engaged in a bloody fight with the French colonialist military, eventually drawing them into a defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. During the First Indochina War, however, the United States backed pretty much, essentially due to negotiations between Roosevelt and leading French politicians, the French colonial government, and it would pull itself into support of an emergent alternative state in the southern portion of the Indochinese Peninsula, which was first simply a client state of the French Empire and French regime, and then gradually emerged as the so-called Republic of Vietnam, where the United States was essentially a military force to back this ever-degrading from within Republic of Vietnam after refusing the provisions of the Geneva Conference. The Geneva Conference would theorize that there would be free and open elections all over Vietnam, uniting the northern and southern portions of the country. However, Ho Chi Minh would be able to stand in these elections, and since it was evident that Ho Chi Minh without question was going to win a unified so-called Democratic Republic of Vietnam and be elected to government, the United States representatives refused to participate, sign the accords, or allow the backing of these elections, and instead propped up their puppet client state of the Republic of Vietnam. Now, within Vietnamese conceptions of geography, there's actually a northern Bắc Bộ, and then a central Trung Bộ, and then a southern Nam Bộ section of Vietnam. The French took these sections, the French colonial government took these sections and divided them into Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China, with Cochin China in the south being a direct colony, but the other two being protectorates, while Cambodia was also a protectorate formed in 1887. Laos was added in 1893, and also Guangzhou won in 1898. The capital of French Indochina was then moved to Saigon in the direct colony of Cochin China, but then moved again to Hanoi in Tonkin in 1902, and then again to Dalat in Annam in 1939. This ever-rotating series of capitals was a French strategy to prevent revolution. It did not work. In 1945, the capital was moved back to Hanoi, and the revolution was fully underway. After the fall of France during World War II, French colonial Indochina was an administration that was essentially governed by the Vichy government, although under Vietnamese control at the local level and under Japanese occupation at the top level until March 1945, when the Japanese had overthrown the colonial regime and then surrendered. The Viet Minh essentially took power. The Viet Minh would be governing in sections of the northern part of the country, but would be opposed to former Emperor Bao Dai. Bao Dai essentially had his private hunting grounds in the central region of the country and was propped up especially by the French in the southern sections. This was deeply connected to the economic structure at play in the delta. Pictured here, you see a dredging machine, which is dredging the canal. It's dredging the Rakia and the Hatian Canal from 1930, which is a process which, in this case, creates a scattered line of woven webs of Keng và Rak, which are essentially canals all across the southern portion of Cochin China, dramatically transforming the ecological landscape of Vietnam and dramatically increasing the rice production of this region, including also the shift of labor from sustainable methods of fishing and farming towards massive rice agriculture, and with that the use of labor that was somewhat forced for sections of the year in what is known as a corvée system throughout this region of the Dongbang Som Cu Long, or the river delta of the Nine Dragons, otherwise known as the Mekong Delta. Now, as you might imagine, it was not just the transformation of the ecological landscape in the Indochinese peninsula into a massive producer of rice agriculture that the French colonial government was interested. Other economic structures included the mining industry, as well as rubber plantations. Now, pictured here, you see the mining industry, and as you might imagine, working in mines under French colonial governance in Indochina, under this corvée labor system in which you were forced to work for certain periods of the year, in that corvée system mandated, backed up by the French colonial military. it was particularly brutal. The same system also backed work and labor conditions on the rubber plantations. And thus, you could see that workers in these particular situations would be particularly primed to rebellion against the French government if given the opportunity and the means to do so. In fact, there were numerous rebellions in French colonial Indochina from the 1860s through the 1880s, especially in 1885, and then again in the 1910s and in the 1920s before the First Indochina War began. Thus, when the First Indochina War began, there was already a popular foment of political support for anti-colonial resistance. Now, you might have heard that after the Viet Minh, led by Von Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh, were victorious in Dien Bien Phu, that there was a massive Catholic migration from northern Vietnam to southern Vietnam in 1954. Indeed, pictured here on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a notable Catholic family who migrated from the northern or lowercase north, do not capitalize that, it's not proper, northern or north Vietnam. Vietnam is capitalized, but not north or northern. This wealthy elite family, pictured here on the right, established themselves deeply in the southern sections of the country as they were relatives of Ngo Dinh Diem, who's pictured on the Time magazine cover from the era on the left. Now, this particular movement of Catholic refugees was known as Operation Passage to Freedom, a term used by the U.S. Navy to describe the propaganda effort specifically to drive fear of communism and the assistance in transporting 300,000 Vietnamese civilian soldiers and non-Vietnamese members of the French army from what was becoming the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to the monarchist southern Vietnam, then known as the State of Vietnam, although that was deeply contested by the northern sections of the country in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which never recognized the State of Vietnam nor the Republic of Vietnam. Nonetheless, the Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed during the course of a transitionary period from 1954 to 1955. The French government and other countries may have transported a further 500,000 refugees driven by these anti-communist propaganda efforts in the northern sections of the country. In the wake of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the Geneva Accords of 1954, the fate of French Indochina after 8 years of war between French colonial Union forces and the Viet Minh was decided. Nonetheless, Ngo Dinh Diem was a Vietnamese politician who became the first prime minister of the state of Vietnam from 1954 to 1955, and then served as the president of the Republic of Vietnam, often known improperly as South Vietnam. Do not, Dios mío, use the name South Vietnam. It is Republic of Vietnam, with Republic and Vietnam capitalized, from 1955 until he was deposed by an assassination plot and military coup in 1963. Diem was born into this prominent Catholic family, the son of a high-ranking civil servant, Ngo Dinh Ca. He was educated at French-speaking schools and considered following his brother Ngo Dinh Thuc into the priesthood, but eventually chose to pursue a civil service career, so to speak. He progressed rapidly in the court of Emperor Bao Dai, becoming governor of Binh Thuan province in 1929 and interior minister by 1933. However, he resigned the latter position after 3 months and publicly denounced the emperor as a tool of the French. Diem came to support Vietnamese hardline nationalism, promoting an anti-communist vision and an anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist third way position, somewhat echoing earlier positions from the 1930s of Europe of emergent authoritarians being opposed to capitalism and opposed to communism. But in this case, it was opposed to colonialism, i.e. a colonialist form of capitalism and opposed to communism. Needless to say, his Kung Lao party, very much like European fascists, relied upon a rhetoric of pro-labor notions, pro-worker notions, and hardline nationalist sentiment. His brother, No Dinh Yu, whose baptismal name was Jacob, was a Vietnamese archivist and politician who became the chief political advisor of the Republic of Vietnam president No Dinh Diem. Although No Dinh Yu had no formal executive position, he wielded immense unofficial power, exercising personal command of both the Arvin Special Forces, a paramilitary unit which served as the Nung family's de facto private army, and the Kung Lao, the Workers' Party, the Personalist Labor Party political apparatus, which served as the regime's de facto secret police, somewhat echoing black shirts, for example. Chun Lei Xuan, who was more popularly known in English as Madame Yu, was the de facto First Lady of the Republic of Vietnam. She's pictured here, and she was de facto First Lady from 1955 through 1963. I say de facto because she was in fact the wife of No Dinh Yu, who was the brother of the president, but the brother of the president was not in an official place of power. So why was she the de facto First Lady? Well, because No Dinh Diem himself was in fact a bachelor. Diem was a lifelong bachelor, and because she and her family lived in the Independence Palace with him, she wielded considerable political power. Indeed, Madame Yu was known for her harsh and incendiary comments that denounced so-called anti-governmental movements, and she also was known for her offensive rhetoric in reference to schools of Buddhism during the Buddhist crisis. She had to live in exile in France, however, after her husband and her brother-in-law Diem were assassinated in a single event in November 2nd of 1963, when in the morning they had been found dead in the streets as a result of the US-backed coup. After this coup d'etat, of course, there would be a rotating door of de facto elected military leaders in the Republic of Vietnam, so-called republic, really just a military republic by that point, to be realistic about the situation, as the secret police continued to hone out suspected communists from the population and were infiltrated by the revolutionary movements in the South as well. Indeed, the story of the Republic of Vietnam is a tragedy in that sense.